Hey, MBA hopefuls. We are live on the air with MBA Waves, talking all things business and education. Today, on episode 163, we are bringing the focus on the Financial Times Global MBA Rankings 2026. And today, we're going to talk about some of the big winners this year in the full-time MBA or Global MBA rankings, what goes into the methodology, just how this is created, and some of the factors that contribute to some of the top players conspicuously absent this year. I am your host today, Eric Lucrezia, along with my co-host, Barra Sapir. How you doing, Barra?
I'm doing great. Good to see both of you.
Absolutely. And we have a special guest today, our friend and fourth time, I believe, guest on MBA Waves, Andrew Jack, the Global Education Editor of the Financial Times. Welcome back. How are you, Andrew?
Thanks. Good to see you both.
Thank you so much for joining us from LaGuardia Airport. I know you're in transit. It's very kind of you to take the time to talk with us about this topic, which so many people want to know about. Just before we get started, don't forget to click like and subscribe to keep MBA Waves going. That really helps us out, no matter if you're listening to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, SoundCloud, Deezer, you name it. We're everywhere now. So let's kick things off with a question I think a lot of people are thinking about. The FTA rankings, Andrew, are highly anticipated every year. What is new or different in the 2026 edition? And before I let you answer, I just have to say this year I feel like it was a big shakeup for me anyway, from my own memory. Like this year we had some of the largest mobility for some schools and also some shockers as well. So what are some of the key standouts to you, Andrew?
Yeah, and well, the first thing I'd say is that I mean it's true that some schools go up and down, and some appear and disappear and reappear year by year. But we need to also keep this in moderation. A few differences in the ranking between number 6 and number 10, or between number 20 and number 30, doesn't mean there's some devastating shift. We try to rank 100 of the leading business schools, in this case for MBAs, around the world. And frankly, all those schools and qualifications that are ranked are of high quality. As we know, there's even possibly tens of thousands of business schools globally that are offering MBAs. So this is a very select list. That said, yes, I mean, this year's number one position was taken for the first time by MIT Sloan School of Management. It's long been one of the leaders, and we often encourage people to look at these business schools in the 4 tiers that we publish, and Sloan has long been in that top tier, but this year it managed to edge ahead of its rivals. And we can talk about perhaps some of the drivers behind that, and perhaps some of at least the themes that reflect why it and others are evolving at the moment. But yeah, so that does very well. Other leading US business schools, of course, appear and perform very strongly, such as Wharton and Harvard. But as we've seen over the years, we also have significant players in other parts of the world, of course, in Europe, notably, for example, INSEAD in France and Singapore, HEC based, of course, in Paris, and the London Business School, but also a number of the Spanish business schools like AICE, and then also several of the Asian ones, notably SEABS, based, of course, in Shanghai, but a joint European-Chinese project. So geographical diversity, strength in numbers, and some really strong performances from a whole bunch of the schools. So I'd emphasize some continuity as well as some bouncing around in the specific ordinal position.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, just before I pass the microphone on to Bara, I mean that's something that I talk to people all the time about. Many of my clients who maybe have concerns about a school that they've long been interested in, that's say ranked, for example, in the 70s or 80s, and I remind them frequently that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of business schools that don't even get onto that top 100 list. So I think just being represented in the top 100 FT rankings is already a huge deal.
Yeah, and obviously we can talk more about the criteria and so on, but it doesn't mean that many of those other schools that students are interested in, or that you and clients are engaging around, are not also worthy. There's obviously very specific criteria we have, and then there's all sorts of other factors that will affect other students. It might be about price, about geography, about specialism, all sorts of other factors or other reasons that mean, for whatever explanation, haven't been part of our ranking, at least in this year.
Right. Well, we'll definitely get to the criteria. What I'm interested in asking about is the methodology. And 2 years ago, we saw some major updates in the methodology that that you use, and that includes metrics like alumni network strength, carbon footprint, and sector diversity. Have you and your team continued with changes in 2026, or have you done anything different?
It's largely been a year of consolidation. There's always some tweaking going on. There's some reflections at the moment, for example, about carbon footprint issues. The big one that we're looking at the moment, but this is in the months ahead, so it's not reflected in this most recent ranking, is thinking about new ways to measure academic output and impact as well. But largely the key factors, we can talk about the specifics, but salary 3 years after graduating remains the most important. That's always been the case, but over the last few years, we've edged down a little bit the weighting on that to rebalance it with some other wider elements.
Makes sense. Interesting.
All right. I think people really want to know about why are some of these major players absent. So I feel like let's not keep people on the edge of their seats any longer. The ones that I noticed, Stanford, GSB, Columbia, NYU Stern, SD Bocconi. Maybe I'm missing a few. So, what's going on here? Give us the scoop.
Yeah, I mean, there's no scoop. I mean, each year there's a few that come in and a few that go out. We try not to go into too specific details because sometimes they're a little bit delicate or subtle or nuanced to explain. But at the high level, there are some school. All of those who take part in our rankings do so in a voluntary way, so they have to agree to participate. And then equally, of course, as you know, they have to be accredited by one of the two big agencies, either ASCSB or
Sure.
EFMD or both. So there's those sort of initial benchmarks. Beyond that, the most fundamental thing that typically happens is just around response rates, because as we've discussed, we use some data. We use some data that's based on the insights provided directly by the schools, such as some of the research inputs and the issues around faculty and student composition and so on. But we also, of course, rely heavily on the questionnaire responses provided by alumni 3 years after they finished their courses. Now, we're still seeing here a little bit, I think, the tail end of COVID and all the disruption that caused with remote learning. And then even as students started to adjust and return to in-person classes, that created some complications. And I think also there's a longer term issue that we're seeing around a general concern over survey fatigue, not just for our rankings, but for all sorts of questionnaires and data points, including, incidentally, in the US, topically, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and some of the data that companies are required to provide by the government. And there are often delays and hitches and glitches with that. So sometimes what you'll have is in a particular year, schools or the alumni don't quite get to the levels of statistical significance that we require to ensure that we've got some pretty robust data to report. So there's no great conspiracy, there's no great mysteries. Each year, as I say, there's some little bit of bouncing around. We're always keen to get as many, certainly of the high quality schools as we can, and to ensure as wide a response rate as possible. And I think, typically in most of these cases, you'll see those schools that weren't in this year returning in future years. And hopefully, and indeed, this is an ongoing consultation, we're keen to engage with others as well. We can also find ways to ensure those response rates remain significant and therefore the students and the schools eligible to be ranked.
I think it was about that. Often I think there's what's the minimum response rate for alumni?
It depends a little bit, but typically we want a sort of 10 to 20% of the cohort. There are minimum absolute numbers and then percentages. So it obviously partly depends also on the class size.
That seems reasonable, 10 to 20%. You said something that kind of caught my attention. I wanted to dig into a little bit. You mentioned survey fatigue. So, I think that's something that is important about the Financial Times rankings is that you require the schools to send out these surveys. You collect a certain amount of data. And if you could just correct me if I'm wrong, but things like, the number of years or months worked and the salary, perhaps bonuses. And I know there's a side that is more qualitative, like satisfaction and aims reached and so forth. Could you agree or disagree with what I've just said? Clarify?
Yeah, so the as I say, the survey that we do, in fact, it's us, it's not the schools that do the survey. The schools provide us with the contacts. We reach out independently. So we're always trying to create a sort of independent arm's length assessment. And yes, I mean, it's a snapshot of hopefully a representative sample of those alumni 3 years after they finished. So obviously some may not be employment, some may be in different sorts of sectors or in different positions professionally and so on. But it's really saying 3 years out, and therefore really trying to capture the mood about the, if you like, the medium term impact. Obviously others do, and we track the immediate postgraduate employment rates, which we take into account. And obviously schools try to track starting salaries immediately after the MBA. But what we want to do is say, let's go a little bit further and see what the impact of that 1 or 2 year MBA study was in terms then of not just the initial recruitment after graduating, but the real value added that the employer is seeing, and therefore the advancement of those graduates in the workplace. They may have switched jobs, of course, they may have been promoted, they may have stagnated. So really trying to capture that. And that's a sort of pretty unique data set that others don't have. And indeed, I think the schools as well as the alumni value to get some sense of the medium term. And 3 years is our focus because, you know, obviously once you start to go further out, one, it gets more and more difficult to re-engage and sample that group. And two, arguably, there are all sorts of other factors at play that might be a bit less linked directly to the education, the MBA that they had, and more to, you know, underlying talents or subsequent experience or networks or whatever that have been achieved. So we found 3 years has been a good data point to use.
Sure, it's about the moment when your MBA has started to really mature.
Matured,
you know? Yeah, and so. Okay, so it's always that population. So we know in 2026, it's people that were graduated in 2023, for example.
Actually, earlier, because so the data was collected in last year, 2025, and then is all cleaned and distilled to be published as it was earlier this month. So it will be those 3 years out from graduating in 2025. So we're talking 22, in fact, or in some cases, there might be some rollover from 21, which obviously, as we say, was still COVID or immediately post-COVID, of course, which had quite a disruptive effect, obviously, on attendance, loyalty, even sometimes sentiment to the experience that they had during and then.
Right. And so to be sure, any given alumni would only be surveyed once, right? Once they've been surveyed for a given year of a ranking, like you'd move on to the next batch and they wouldn't be subsequently surveyed, or am I wrong?
Yeah, no, that's correct. Yes, I mean, there's data on the current cohorts provided by the schools, but the alumni data, those 3 years out, is collected in that one-shot questionnaire that goes out a few months before. So in 2025, in this case, for the 2026 ranking. We can also talk, incidentally, perhaps later in this conversation, but in the package of reporting and data and analysis that we put together in this year's MBA ranking and magazine, we also did a much longer term and broader survey of MBAs and other business school graduates from around the world over many years, which we can come back to, which was providing an interesting, fresh data point. Happy to chat about that later.
Yeah, sure. And so, you know, it's good that, you know, you get the contacts from the schools. It's the FT that is reaching out to the alumni to have a little bit of distance to guarantee, to ensure more objectivity and so forth. At the same time, as I understand, the salary reporting is self-reported. Do you receive any criticism for that? How do you deal with assuring that a student, because of course they're interested in having their own alma mater being higher ranked, so higher salary plays into that. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, we're not the IRS. We're not auditors. We're not the employers. We don't have the pay slips. So of course, there's an element of honesty. But all that said, you know, I mean, first of all, there are a number of statistical tests and benchmarks that we can use. So we can look at, you know, where there might be some creative accounting, should we say. We can look at past trends. We can look at cohorts and peers from the same school and class, but also from other comparable schools. So there's actually a lot of third-party benchmarks that our data team will use to try to get a sense of the quality and to sort of raise any concerns. And though, as you say, of course, there can be a sort of a temptation perhaps to kind of hype your school. That can also backfire. You know, sometimes you'll find that there may be, as we said, particularly during and post-COVID, some students who are frustrated and so have less incentive in raising the positioning of their school through the data that they control and influence. And also, of course, there's a potential consequence, because clearly if there was to be a overstatement of some of the salaries, then that could backfire in terms of subsequent student groups that are applying on certain expectations. So I think there's also a whole series of sort of balancing acts. And I should say a final thing we do is a certain degree of statistical smoothing. So we do tend to remove the outlying, the very high salaries. We remove the bonuses, for example, from financial sector employees. And we also adjust. So we're not just saying, you know, if you earned more or indeed claim to earn more, that will automatically lift your school's position in the ranking. We're weighting it according to sectors and typical pay scales. So, for example, we take into account, but we calibrate for those who go into public sector jobs in government, for instance, who'll typically obviously earn less immediately or 3 years or longer term than those who go into banking or tech, for instance.
You anticipated my next question. I mean, it must be an arduous, lengthy task, and so just to share some appreciation for that. I was going to ask about outliers, so it sounds like you do that already, and adjusting for factors of different industries and sectors that would definitely have quite a range. You're working in finance consulting, that's one end of the spectrum. You get the idea. But what about countries? I mean, everything is inflated in the US, right? You know, it's higher cost of tuition, more scholarships, higher salaries, much, you know, greater cost of living in the US. How do we deal with that in understanding salary in the context of the FT ranking?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, we try to adjust in both directions, if you like, because we have absolute salaries and increases in salaries that are taken into account. And we also have an adaptation around the world based on where the alumni now are for purchasing power parity. So in other words, those who go on to work in or are based in India or China, for example, or other lower income countries, there can be an upwards adjustment to reflect, obviously, the differential cost of living. And that works in the same way or the other way, if you like, for the US, for example. So there's an attempt to kind of level the playing field through that. And as I say, there are those other broader comparators using the absolute data that also help to adjust. I mean, no system is perfect. You know, we work with World Bank, IMF, and others trying to understand the most rigorous statistical methodology that would adapt. But, you know, this is a ranking of global MBAs. And as we know, this is a market in business education that is increasingly global, and indeed where more and more of the demand is actually coming notably from Asia. And so I think it's important that we also try to reflect that rather than simply focusing on, as you say, what are very high nominal salaries, but also very significantly higher costs in the US. So that's on the salary part. And then, of course, there are other adjustments we make, because we do a value for money adjustment, which is part of our ranking weightings as well. So in other words, there we'll look at the salary, but we'll offset that against the duration of the course and against tuition fees, net of scholarships and discounts and so on. So there's a whole series of adjustments that try to take those factors into account.
So how does duration
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, and as we said earlier, you know, we've also over the years, we've somewhat reduced the weighting that we give to salary. We do think, you know, the outcome and salary is fundamental. This, after all, is a business degree, and financial returns are fundamental. And of course, throughout the world, the cost of an MBA is quite elevated. But, you know, it's roughly a third of our total weighting. And there's a bunch of other things that we're also taking into account. And I should say, you know, though a lot of people just focus on the headline number and the headline rank, and therefore MIT in this case, you know, the way we present our data, including on our rankings website, allows individual users, whether they're students, prospective alumni, prospective students, faculty, recruiters, or others, to do much deeper dives and to select the individual data points they want to look at and to re-rank. So, you know, if you're looking for pure salary, you get one set of results. If you're more interested in research or in, you know, geographical location or a whole bunch of the other factors we've talked about or will discuss in this podcast, there are many other ways to slice and dice the data that can provide much more granular insights. And we'd really encourage people to use those more. You can also download it all as a spreadsheet and play around with it at your leisure.
Mm.
Andrew, I wanted to just jump in and say I was reading the Poets and Quants article. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, if that's, and I thought it was super interesting, and it's certainly scandalous that they brought up that schools might be cheating. And I wanted to know if you wanted to talk about that point, or if there's a way that schools are helping to get more alumni for buy-in or engagement so that they aren't kicked off the list. But I was kind of surprised to hear that point. And did you want to comment on that?
Look, I mean, from time to time, we certainly hear, claims, allegations around cheating. Typically, as you might expect, it comes from, one school talking about another, not about their own.
Of course not.
I have to say that there are instances that are picked up. We always take all of the claims very seriously. We investigate them. As you know, we have a rotating audit by an external auditing firm, in fact, KPMG. And so basically a tenth of the schools go through an audit each year. So over a decade or so, we're covering the full range of schools. And we do this across a number of the different rankings as well. As I said, we apply our own statistical tests, and we're always looking whenever there's any sort of report, or whether there are self-generated anomalies that would suggest to us that we need to probe in more detail. And there's certainly, I won't go into the details, but there certainly are occasions when we have, shall we say, parted ways mutually with schools for a period where there's been concern. I mean, look, there's always issues about the potential for manipulation and tweaking. We know in certain other rankings that are out there, it's even led to criminal prosecutions in the past in the US. So there are temptations, of course, for that sort of thing to happen. I think we've probably got as robust a set of metrics as is possible to have. That's on the the individual data points, if you like. On your other point around, more generally the sample sizes, as we said, we're always trying to push towards the most representative series of responses from alumni that's possible to get. So the more that in cooperation with the schools, we are able to get a higher response rate, the better. And again, as we've said, we'll do some readjustment where necessary to try to ensure that that is representative of the full cohort. But we'd much rather have a 90% response rate than a 5% one, obviously. So yes, I mean, there's always comments. We take them seriously. Sometimes there are actions, but I wouldn't read too much into individual schools that might appear and disappear year by year, because, as I say, there's all sorts of other more innocent explanations and factors behind that as well.
Yeah,
Just circle back. Go ahead, Barry.
I was saying that I thought it was super interesting too that the Poets and Quants article mentioned that people are not checking their email as much, and so other ways to reach potential candidates for the survey itself might be more easily reached by phone or WhatsApp or other modalities than the email. I thought that was an interesting sort of a threshold that we've reached.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was at a big academic conference of social scientists in all sorts of disciplines not long ago, and it was an issue they were talking about, survey fatigue. We know as well, it happens in companies, it happens in research, it happens in market research. All sorts of factors are at work here. So I think there's a broader challenge for not just this industry or sector, but the whole country or the world, if you like, in terms of how to identify and collect meaningful and representative data. And that could be people feel overwhelmed. There's more and more surveys. It could be there's other priorities. They're overwhelmed with work in different ways or uncertainties and so on. So I mean, yeah, these are factors that we take into account. We have an ongoing discussion, and I'm very keen, including from your listeners and watchers, about improved ways to do this. But certainly we work with the schools, so it's not simply that we send out an emailed survey and that's the end of it. There's a regular process during in advance of, and then during the process when the surveys are open, that we are using and the schools themselves are using to track response rates and try to outreach to their former alumni, whether in events or through all sorts of different, messaging formats. So, there are multiple ways in which they can be attuned, made aware, prodded to try and respond to it. But yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect science, and it's something that I think we're all facing. But, unfortunately, perhaps I've yet to see great alternatives that are out there. And as I say, it's one thing at the immediate point of graduation and recruitment, because there's a little bit more consistency, of course, with large numbers who are being hired to the big consulting firms or others. It gets much more messy and complicated when you start to progress in your career.
Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So circling back to one of the things you were talking about in terms of weighting or adjusting, had to do with the duration of the program. And I was just curious, how do you weight that? Because, over at this point, over the years, thousands, if not tens of thousands of applicants, potential prospects, and so forth that I've spoken to that see the duration of a program differently. What I mean is that some people see a shorter program as added value because you're back to the workforce quickly, quicker to not only be making money, but having that kind of impact and so forth. Whereas other people see a longer program as like, well, I'm getting more bang for my buck, more courses, more time in the classroom, etc. So how do you guys weight program duration?
Well, we try to consider an MBA as a sort of, comparable unit, if you like. So we're not re-weighting based on if it's 24 months or 12 months or 16 months, because there's obviously quite a lot of variance within it. We can try to, obviously there are certain elements within the weighting, like the value for money, that hopefully to some degree will calibrate automatically based on the duration. If you're paying 1 year's tuition rather than 2, for example, that will have a differential impact clearly on the value for money calculations compared with your salary when you come out. In others, like the absolute salary data or the research outputs of the faculties at the schools that students are studying at, that's independent clearly of the duration of the period. And there's only so much that we can do to readjust to those periods. So that's on the calculation aspect of it. In terms of what we're seeing in the evolution of the field, if you like, I think we're seeing, obviously we've seen for a long time this move towards stackable programs. Sometimes if you've got a master's program or even a bachelor's, it might allow some degree of credits to be transferred across in the same university or even in a different one now at the MBA level. It will certainly reflect potentially what core courses or electives you might be able to do or allowed to not do. There's obviously this huge issue, not only of cost, but opportunity costs. So as you say, as we know, historically, business degrees often, certainly the MBA has been seen as a bit counter-cyclical. So demand might go up at a time, the job market is a bit more precarious if people are losing jobs anyway, or it's seen as a good opportunity. I think to some degree at the moment, that relationship's breaking down. As we know, particularly in the US, North America, and Europe, Western Europe, we've seen a lot of uncertainty in terms of graduate placement and recruitment. So the idea that, you might step down from your past job, spend 2 years studying, invest quite a considerable amount in tuition, sacrifice your salary during that period, and then hope for a big uptick, is a little bit less certain than it was. There's more people who are 3 months out, haven't got jobs, or are kind of in a bit of a holding pattern. And I think there's quite a lot of people at the moment, particularly as we can discuss around AI and so on, who are kind of, they may have a job and they're kind of thinking they'd rather stick with it for now rather than take the risk of pulling out of that current degree of security for a year or two when there's so much disruption, and maybe not have a job to return to in their former employer, let alone prospects elsewhere. So I think, there's a lot of restructuring taking place at the moment, and that's part of some of the wider geographical patterns we're seeing in terms of demand for MBAs from around the world.
Okay, good to know.
Andrew, I wanted to, I'm curious, you were talking before about how we're looking at folks who graduated in 2021 post-COVID. And I'm wondering if you're anticipating anything interesting, given maybe we shouldn't talk about politics, but like given all of the disruption and unrest that's happening in higher education, is there any sort of talk at the water cooler about what might happen a few years from now?
So I think one thing clearly, I think domestically within the US, as you know, the MBA market has somewhat stabilized, if not stagnated, and that's been a slightly longer term trend. I think the bigger impact around the perceptions of the US for international students is a much bigger game changer. And of course, that's been a huge pipeline for business schools bringing in recruits at the master's level, whether for MBAs or for other more specialist master's degrees in the past few years, particularly historically from China and then from India. And certainly if we're looking at applications and expressions of interest going forwards, we're seeing a drop in that. And at least part of that is about the perception about the current administration in the White House. In the short term, that could be to some degree concerns about what's happening in universities and financial stability or robustness of courses. Perhaps more significantly, clearly, a number of the international students who've applied in the past to the US have done so in the hope that they would then be able to stay and work in the US, whether short term or potentially longer term, with an entry route into a green card or US citizenship. And that in particular, obviously, has been very substantially disrupted with all of the debates around the H-1 visa, whether there'd be quotas, what the costs would be of applying, whether employers in this more uncertain time economically and politically would be willing to pay the costs and sponsor graduates of any sort, and certainly foreign students. And then, frankly, the activities we've seen to some degree around ICE and a sort of anti-immigrant hostility on campuses. So I think that's had a big external effect, and I think that will continue to play out, albeit I think for many international students, the US is still seen, because of its economic growth and dynamism, as an attractive place to come. The final area around the politics we should talk about is, of course, around DEI, ESG, some of those areas that were, quite important, obviously, even within business schools. And there, I think we're certainly seeing, at the very least, perhaps a little bit of a rebranding or a de-emphasizing in a public way of some of those initiatives. But all that said, I think at the same time, even if there was some, should we say, some interventions and approaches that looked a little bit more strong on ideology or policy than they did on evidence in the past, I think business schools in the US as well as elsewhere were, a little bit less on the front line and exposed than certain other faculties and disciplines, and two, have argued and continue, in my view, legitimately to argue that these are actually, if framed and analyzed in a rigorous way, legitimate business risks. If there's geopolitical decoupling and political tensions, there are huge supply chain implications. Climate change, let's state it, is a fact. We're getting a lot more uncertainty in weather, as we can witness both on the East and the West Coast in recent days here in the US. That again can affect supply chains, customer demand, all sorts of factors. So, to argue that these elements are, as it were, things that are simply ideological and should be removed would be dangerous. And I think most business schools are quite right into continuing to focus on those, albeit perhaps with a greater focus or framing around the rigor and the importance in business strategy and risk that they imply. And so that continues to be important, even if it's a little less in the spotlight than some of the kind of high profile campaigns and reactions we've seen in US higher education in the last few months.
Yeah.
So would you say that this rebranding, for example, of DEI, would the rankings also create a sort of language that would also reflect that rebranding, where you're still emphasizing or showing this piece outwardly, even though it looks different?
Look, I mean, first of all, there's been some slightly, how shall I put this, contentious reporting elsewhere suggesting in some way that even some of the criteria that we use in our weightings are pushing business schools to break the law. I mean, let me just say categorically, that's a nonsense. I mean, first of all, there is, as far as I'm aware, tell me if I'm wrong, there is no ban on requests for information. Whether schools or anybody else choose to do it is up to them. Beyond that, though, again, as far as I'm aware, you know, there is no explicit action to, for example, I don't know, limit initiatives that are trying to encourage women to be hired as faculty or to be students. And I think most best practice and research would argue that that's a good thing, to be more representative of your workforce, of your consumer base, of wider society. So diversity in other senses, for example, ethnicity and so on, is something we've never measured. And that's partly, frankly, because it's really complex to do in terms of, particularly again for a global ranking, because different countries do have different definitions, contexts, and indeed rules on reporting. As for ESG, again, I mean, I think we do believe that these are important business risks that leaders need to take into account. They do continue to be taught and reflected on and researched by faculty in business schools in the US as well as elsewhere around the world. And so I think you'll certainly see a continued attempt by us to capture those elements, and certainly thinking about issues like climate and gender diversity within business schools as fundamental areas of importance.
I guess I guess with what's actually happening here, which is a bit, as a woman, a bit horrifying. I would say, I wonder if there's any attempt to look at, for example, families that are. I mean, this administration is really pushing towards women having children, and so what's the impact on the graduates, for example, that are women or men, and their family life that emerges 3 years after? That might be an interesting piece.
Well, I mean, certainly if we're heading into a sort of Margaret Atwood dystopia,
I think we are. I think we are.
There's all sorts of concerns. I mean, yeah, I mean, personally, when I was studying demography and fertility, I think, you know, we all understood that there was a demographic transition that takes place, and birth rates typically fall when, first of all, healthcare improves, and so infant mortality is no longer an issue. Secondly, when societies become more supportive, and therefore, you know, for example, healthcare more generally and other forms of support exist, including the creation of pensions, so children are no longer required in quite the same way to be supporting their parents financially into old age. And so, you know, inevitably there's a transition downwards to lower birth rates. Now, how far this will continue to be a mantra and how far it will influence higher education and business schools, I think still a bit of an open question. But I mean, I agree. I think it would be quite concerning if it was removing women, in this case, particularly from the workforce or education. I think, you know, clearly what we largely see in terms of birth rates is human aspiration and choice and empowerment, and that should be encouraged. And I think, you know, access to, and therefore even to some degree tracking the response in terms of the demand and the representation of women as students and faculty, amongst other things, is an important thing to keep in mind. I haven't so far seen, happily, any radical job on that globally or indeed in the US. But I mean, as you say, who knows? That partly depends on what happens in the current political cycles and how far some of those mantras get taken up in practice.
Really interesting stuff. Both of what you guys are saying. I mean, back to climate change, you were saying seeing things on the east and west coast of the US. I can say the southwest of France is pretty much underwater right now. All around Bordeaux, we've had like 40 days of rain nonstop. So it's everywhere. Climate change is a real thing, and I'm happy that the Financial Times has that, even though it's 1%, still it is a metric taken into account, carbon footprint for the schools.
And I was going to say slightly more than that, actually, because, you know, as you know, there's a carbon footprint measure there's also a measure in looking at sort of what's taught in courses as well. Yeah, and as you say, I mean, I was at an event a few months ago where various large multinational companies were talking about, for example, as we've seen the River Rhine reduce in height with lower rain and then periodically with flooding, it was causing very substantial issues for some of their manufacturing that was shipped. Similarly on the Mississippi in the US. So, I mean, these are very real business consequences of environmental changes that are significantly man-made and influenced. And whatever is behind them, whether we're thinking about trying to reduce the level of warming or we're thinking about mitigation and adaptation, these are fundamental issues for businesses and for business schools to address.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this affects the supply chain. When you have extreme and erratic weather, this affects how we can conduct business, and it's definitely been increasing for all that we have recorded data on in terms of storms and things like this. When it comes to diversity, clearly the Financial Times has maintained metrics that include diversity in terms of national origin, I believe, as well as gender in the faculty and the student body, which is great. Interesting how you point out, you mentioned ethnicity, or let's also say perhaps race, where you speak to an American, someone from the United States specifically, think of diversity, that is often the first thing we think of, whereas at least my experience as an American, 20 years living abroad, diversity is more about national origin, which is something more taken into consideration and also more clear, objective. I mean, what passport do you have? It's like it's much clearer. In terms of are there pressures, political or societal, to increase women or put pressure women to have children? Well, just look at Project 2025. They've laid it all out for us. But the way birth rates may have fluctuated, I can't comment. There are too many factors that influence that. Even wealth, right? Wealth of a nation that tends to decrease birth rates, and we'll see. But what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, with the remaining time we have, is to focus on some of the big winners. Like, first of all, MIT, bravo. I think it's the first time they've been in the number one position, although they've floated in the top 5 to 10 position forever, I guess. Considered one of the M7, Boston, perhaps the academic capital of the United States, if not the world. And let's celebrate MIT for a moment. What can you tell us about them and how they got there?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the weightings and the factors speak for themselves, but they performed very well to be in that top position on a number of elements, including the salary and the research and alumni networks and the like. And I think it's always difficult to tease out, obviously, if you look at any of those metrics or some of the wider ones or the broader perception, exactly what is at work or has contributed year by year. But certainly I would say that MIT is very much in the zeitgeist. This is a very obviously traditionally STEM strong engineering, computer science, technical school, of course, one of the most reputed in the world. And so perhaps it's not surprising at a time when
that's where business is going.
Yeah, exactly. When all of the discussion and all of the disruption we're seeing in business, in innovation, even within education, is around AI, that
Right.
A school that really has that as a kind of core element of what's operations is performing well.
It's baked into their program.
It's baked in. So there's that sort of, if you like, technical, rigorous, sort of slightly engineering, analytical mindset. And then, of course, they've got a recently appointed dean who was actually previously at Apple. And he has, I know, laid emphasis, amongst other things, on still greater efforts at interdisciplinary work with different schools, including the School of Engineering. So that's always there in the background, as in other business schools. Of course, students sometimes have options to take courses elsewhere or to bring in faculty who are from other parts of the university. But I think, over time, we're going to see more and more tighter integration and combination qualifications. So I think, at a time of disruption, a time of workforce uncertainty, at a time when clearly technology and analytics and AI are at the fore, certainly MIT is pretty well positioned to take advantage of that. And as you say, obviously that Boston area, one of a few key hubs of economic growth across the US, alongside, of course, Silicon Valley, New York for finance, and a couple of others. But clearly one of the big powerhouses, not just for higher education, but for that combination of different areas, including, of course, around biotech and pharma and health, but also around tech more generally.
Yeah. And that said, I mean, looking a bit eastward, we see two schools in India that really catapulted up. I mean, ISB has been doing great in the rankings for a number of years now. Now they're in, I think, number 12. So top 15, top 20, that's fantastic. And there's a whole bunch of IIMs. Often I've seen in the past Ahmedabad leading the IIMs, but Bangalore this time, they're in what, number 34, is it? So yeah, India is really becoming a dominant force in them.
Yeah, I mean, of course, ISB, as you say, long been successful. A bit of a different entity to the Indian Institutes of Management, of course. It was created a little bit out of the model of Harvard Business School and with a lot of partnership with McKinsey and other employers, but continues to be and have a very strong reputation. And then obviously the IIMs, including, those two that you've cited that have performed well in the past, and a number of the others, are powerhouses. I mean, India is, of course, a huge country, a vast population, a very large number of extremely talented students, ultra competitive process to get in. So it's not surprising that they are the real cream of Indian elite education, and therefore that not only is there a kind of virtuous circle attracting high quality faculty and students, but then of course their students on graduating typically go on to some of the best jobs in India and beyond. And of course India itself domestically is more and more a focus of the world around economic growth and development, not least in tech. So again, not surprising we're seeing that growth in power and an influence and impact.
Now, is this the first time that we've seen an Australian school in the top 50? I know AGSM, I think they're 48th this year. Is this the first time we've seen that?
Yes, I can't remember all the full historical data, but certainly, I think a number of the Australian schools are rising up or periodically emerging into those leading ranks. Again, I wouldn't necessarily, make a huge distinction between School 48 and School 53 or whatever.
Of course not.
But of course, the Australians there are some very impressive business schools there, and of course they have a big focus, including notably, amongst others, students from elsewhere in Asia, including, of course, though they have some periodic geopolitical tensions, but periodically with China as well. And so again, you would expect if those students are perhaps then, amongst the brightest and most talented, and perhaps then historically have gone back to their country of origin in the case of China or elsewhere where there's strong economic growth, that will also be reflected partly in the schools, the Australian schools that they were studying at, and their performance in the rankings.
Before we talk about future, I gotta be a little bit unbiased for the moment. ESSEC Business School is one of the ones that really shot up this year. They moved up, I believe, 23 places to number 24 in the world. Now, I started working at ESSEC in 2014, and they weren't even ranked at all. They had only 3 graduated classes of roughly 20, 25 people, and there's that minimum 30 you have to have for, I think, 3 years in a row before you're even considered. And so I understood quickly back then in 2014 that, okay, this is the first mission. Get this school ranked, get them on the map on the global stage. And it took a few years, but we got there. And I think they entered around 97. And each year they got a little bit better and better. 93, somewhere in the 70s. I think they were 57 or something last year. And now to see them in the top 25 is phenomenal. So really hats off to them.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably better qualified than me to talk about them. But I mean, as you know, the French business education sector is very competitive. It punches above its weight in a lot of rankings, and in the number of schools, some of which have come up through this more historic partnership with chambers of commerce, but others that are emerging with different sort of business models. And so it's a very lively place. And a lot of those schools are competing very fiercely, not only for French, but of course for European and international students. So it's not surprising we see that and a number of the other leading schools performing strongly.
Looking forward, I mean, I'm interesting if you have any thoughts about the recent trade deal between the European Union and India. Macron's been over there recently, President Macron of France, and it is not only about tax-free or duty-free goods, but it is very much also about drawing talent. And maybe, as we're seeing you just mentioned these schools in India, there's also a couple in Singapore and China that have really been rising up in the ranks, a way to keep those titles of top ranked schools in France and the West in general by bringing those brilliant minds to schools here in Europe. What do you think about this?
So, I mean, I think, historically, international and particularly Asia origin students dominantly were from China. Obviously, geopolitics has started to complicate that to some degree. But at the same time, also, it's not only some degree of cross-border reluctance, as it were, playing out through the politics. Of course, China has hugely invested in its domestic higher education sector. India, somewhat for a number of the European and North American schools, has substituted as the largest provider of international students. And I think that's also partly, frankly, one, as we've discussed, because there's a fairly small number of highly competitive domestic institutions, the IIMs, which means there's an awful lot of others who are highly talented but don't find places and therefore are looking elsewhere. India, I think, historically has perhaps, frankly, underinvested in its talent and in developing new higher education institutions. In the last few years, and notably under Modi, there has been more of an attempt to do that. And we've also started to see a number of foreign business schools, not least from the UK and Australia, starting to put their toe in the water and either establish campuses or partnerships or branch entities of some form. And so we're, on the one hand, we're seeing the gradual growth in more domestic higher education institutions, but also international players starting to move more into that space. But it's a difficult equation because, if you're going in as a European or American or Australian school, let's say, at what point are you providing that same sort of education, which has been obviously created and sustained through, often quite highly paid academics from those countries and cultures, into a different place where obviously the cost base is very different and where the tuition charges would typically be much lower to provide access. As well as, of course, the complexities of the politics and the finances and so on. So it's a kind of messy time in terms of trying to understand where the new stakes are. But I think clearly we're seeing a little bit of decoupling, or at least tensions, particularly with China. I think also post-COVID, there was some sense that a lot of Chinese families perhaps wanted to see often their only child from the one-child policy that was widespread until relatively recently, wanting them to be closer to home for all sorts of reasons of personal support as well as maybe even physical security. And so we're probably still seeing a little bit of the tail of that and how that's being perhaps a force for evolution in that more traditional process of students from Asia going to Europe or the US to study.
Yep, absolutely. Love those thoughts. Barry, you want to ask anything else before we wrap it up today?
I'm just impressed that I feel like we've just scratched the surface. There's so many other things I'd want to ask, but we really do probably need to wrap it up. Is there anything that you would recommend to schools in order for them to get ranked? Is there anything new that they could be more involved with?
So the first thing I'd say, as you mentioned, I mean, we talk a lot about the ranking, which obviously, as we've said, appears each year. The MBA is just one of 7 or more rankings that we do. So I think, all schools, as well as recruiters and students and prospective students, should also think about not only the individual data points in any one of these rankings, like the MBA, but also think about some of those other possible qualifications that might be worth exploring. And those are, we're seeing obviously a lot of emergence of more specialist master's degrees, and indeed even students choosing to do business majors as an undergraduate more. So those different combinations, and as we discussed, the stackable degrees and the issues about longer term and lifelong learning are also factors that are worth taking into account. But the other thing I should say, as I mentioned earlier, we, alongside the ranking, we publish a magazine and a series of articles online, which are all free to read outside our paywall. And that included, for the first time this year, a broader questionnaire that we did with the Beta Gamma Sigma Honours Society of Business School graduates from around the world, along with Shaw Business School and the AACSB. And that was attempting to really capture the mood across graduates from a large number of business schools over decades, some who graduated in the 1970s. So there's a lot of interesting data there that's also worth looking at. And I'd say the high level picture is even below the top 100 or so that we rank. There is a lot of, largely the metric is a pretty positive one. People are pretty satisfied with their experience and their qualification. They assess the knowledge they learned, but also, of course, the networks they built as being very important. They map out and we chart some of the skill areas that on reflection they considered were the most important at the time, but also the ones they think are the most important today. So there's a message for future generations. And even though actually quite a lot didn't earn very, very high salaries, some many decades into their careers after an MBA or other business degree, there's a pretty high degree of satisfaction of most about that qualification and the experience it provided to them. So I think lots of ideas there. That's a broader survey that we intend hopefully to iterate and repeat in the future. So it also provides a broader benchmark that might be useful for schools and others to look at for inspiration and ideas.
I love it. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Andrew, before we let you go, final bit of advice for anyone listening, any MBA hopefuls how you advise them to approach the rankings as they embark on their MBA admissions journey.
So as we said, of course, there are other rankings, but we would consider ours is pretty robust, particularly if you want the global perspective and you want granular data that you can spit out, and you want insights into outcomes, including salary. But rankings can only be part of the game. As we say, there's all sorts of nuances. Certainly an aggregate ranking can only provide a certain amount of insight. And I would really encourage people to go into the details of this and any other data sets. But, it should really only be one of a number of factors that people take into account in deciding whether as well as where to go and indeed what degree to study. And I mean, first and foremost, it's clearly about talking to the schools, talking to others, external consultants, faculty, above all, perhaps alumni and existing students. And of course, these days through LinkedIn and so on, it's very easy to reach out to those folks. And if you want the instant snapshot of how things really are on the ground now, there's really no substitute for trying to do that level of deep research. But I think also, we're living in a very disruptive world when there's lots of debate around the costs and the opportunity costs, as we've said. And so I think it's a moment to reflect on really what you want, if it's the right moment, and what sort of qualification would be really useful to you going forwards before making a decision.
I love it. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're in transit right now. I think the sound quality is pretty good. I heard you very well. So thank you once again, and great to see you. And we'll see you around soon.
Thanks very much. Good to be part of the program.
Guys, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay on top of all the MBA Waves content. Take care and best of luck.